Medieval Combat Video Review. This is, on the right, in the red, we have Duke Edward. On the left, we have Sir Corvus. These guys are fighting with greatswords, longswords, SCA combat rules. This is a practice that they're at, so the footage is of training. And a hard blow to the head or body with the weapon kills. A hard blow to the arm or leg is disabling to that limb, and then from the knees down and the hands are invulnerable. These guys can also stab. So let's take a look at the fight. We'll go through one pass at a time, and I'll do some breakdown and analysis. So you can see their swords are relatively similar length. Corvus might have a slightly longer sword. So there, what happened in that first pass is Corvus took Duke Edward's left arm. Fighting with one arm with a greatsword is kind of pointless, so what he basically said there was, I give up the fight. So let's take a look at that quick pass. And it's pretty typical of what you'll see with greatswords. They set up at distance. Duke Corvus is threatening with the thrust right now, so a quick thrust to the face would end the fight very quickly. And Duke Edward, will see this in these passes, follows sort of one strategy while Corvus follows another. So Duke Edward is going to cut towards Corvus's blade and attempt to knock that point out of the way while he closes and moves in for a cut. And you see Corvus actually moves his blade out of the way as the attack against the blade comes. So Corvus moved his blade out of the way. At this point, Duke Edward recognizes that, so goes into a high stance. So now they're both pretty primed for cutting. Duke Edward's got forward momentum. Because this is taken from a YouTube video, the swords get a little blurry, so we might need to go through in slow motion instead of frame by frame. If you can't quite figure out where a blade is, take a look at the hands, and generally the blade's in a straight line with that. So at this point, most of the defense is going to be coming from the portion of the blade here, because the hands are invulnerable. People end up blocking with the haft a fair bit. You're not intentionally putting your hands in the way of the shot. That hurts. It's a little dangerous, and it's also not allowed. But you get a lot of defense from the haft, and then also from the bottom portion of the weapon is where you're getting most of your defense. The other thing to point out here, Corvus is able to take a much wider grip. So if you look at the distance between his hands, he's got a lot more leverage by being able to torque on the space between those. Whereas Duke Edward's hands, especially with a little bit boxier gauntlets, are much closer together. So you can see right away that Corvus is going to be able to do more levering movements, where, for the sake of argument right now, if you were to push this hand forward and this hand back, he's got a pretty good lever around this point in the center to do rotation. Whereas if Duke Edward were to do the same thing, he's got much less leverage to do so. So you'll see the opportunity for Edward's attacks tends to come more from, you know, the shoulder and upper arm, whereas Corvus has the opportunity to do it from the hand. All right, so moving in, they've both put their blade across their body. And at this point, you see Edward's moved. His point has come across to his left side, so his blade is tipped towards us a little bit, and Corvus sees this opening here and throws for that space and takes the arm. Edward's almost able to push the defense over to his left side far enough to block with the haft. You can see he actually managed to align it so it strikes between the hands, but it catches him in the arm first. And I think, you know, the second one probably skipped, but Edward's already taking the first shot. So let's take a look at the next pass. Set up at a similar range. Now Edward's point is online as well. Edward may not have a stabbing tip on there. It looks like he does. It's hard to say. Corvus makes a stab for the arm. It's deflected. Okay, and there what happened, Duke Edward gave up the fight because he'd been hit in the leg. He technically could continue to fight on kneeling, but said, let's just call it there. So this one we'll take a look in slow motion because it's a little easier to track. That thrust is deflected by a small movement of Duke Edward's hands. and Corvus lets Edward get in a little closer before this attack starts. Now watch as Edward rotates his hands to the left and to the right, sort of changing guards a couple times. So here we can see some pretty good movement from Corvus. He's flowing well from position to position. I like his movement here. So they're both taking pretty measured paces, right? So they're both going right foot forward, which gives them the advantage of reach. But here, if you watch Corvus's footwork when he steps back, he drops for that shot. Edward blocks it effectively with the haft. Corvus actually swaps to the other leg forward and gets into that position slightly before Edward is able to. And you see him look at a couple shots, call them off. Now at this point, if you're Edward, you've got a couple opportunities. You can rotate the blade toward the camera a little bit and attempt to throw somewhere into this region or into the body. Or you can try to maybe do like a shoulder roll to get Corvus to drop the tip of his sword down and then attempt to go for like a high line strike to the head. The challenge with that is if Edward strikes down into this quadrant, Corvus can raise this hand for defense while dropping this hand on the attack, bringing his own blade in for counter, and he's still guarding his head with the haft of his own weapon. Now, here we see that he doesn't do that. This left hand does drop down, right? So now that head is wide open on the left side, the shoulders open on the left side. So if Edward had been throwing into that space, now that Corvus's hand is dropped, he's vulnerable to the counter cut. Little difficult to do, though, because your defense and your offense are the same. So here, this blow from Corvus is pretty clearly coming into Duke Edward's lower torso or legs. And Duke Corvus has the opportunity to take him in the head or neck at this point, but to do so, he'd have to give up his defense. Now, in the SCA, you might trade that blow. You might say, okay, you can hit me in the leg, I'll hit you in the head, I win, you lose. But if you're sort of thinking like a historical swordsman, you definitely don't want to get chopped in the leg by a long sword, period. In this case, the defense doesn't get there either, and that blow comes in, so might as well have committed to the offense. Now the blow comes in a little late, and it's coming in low. You can actually see that Duke Edward stops the blow from landing. That might have been pretty painful into Corvus's ribs at this point, but you see he sort of stops the blow and says, yeah, you got me. And again, this is a friendly bout for the purposes of training, so they're obviously chit-chatting. We also don't know if they're fighting their very best. We'll just assume that they are. So that's a pretty cool little exchange. There's feints from each of them in this. So let's take a look at those feints really quick. So here you've got both of them. If you look at where the hands are, it's a little difficult with the camera here. Both of them have both of their hands pushed to their left side. So the swords are crossed in front of them, and Corvus's blade is actually coming towards the camera a little bit. Duke Edward's blade is going away from the camera just a little bit. And then watch the body motion as we go frame by frame. First, a little push. Sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit. Just a little push against Edward's sword right there. Step forward. Raise for the feint. Now, Corvus sees that there's not a good opportunity to strike here. And Edward can counter, so they're both concerned about the other person's blow. When you throw with a greatsword, you create an opening, guaranteed. So Edward goes to throw and doesn't because he sees now, if you look again from this angle, if I had like a 3D camera, I'd rotate us around. Corvus's blade is still tipped towards the camera, so it's relatively easy for him to defend if Edward chops straight down. And Corvus instead, after that first pause, go back a little bit. If we go in slow-mo, you can see it's not just straight up and I chop. There's a pause there. That little hesitation was enough that he was able to spot Edward's shoulder and chop around Edward's defense. So Edward froze up just a bit, and Corvus paused for just a second, which exposed Edward's elbow. So look at that in slow motion. There's a little pause, and then the shoulder. And you can see Edward's defense almost got there. Corvus got just a bit around it. So Edward's defense comes, he moves his hands that way. Tries to move them back, doesn't get them back in time. So it was Corvus's movement that got Edward to move his hands from the left side of his body to the right side of his body. That created the shoulder opening. Corvus fired for it. Edward couldn't get his hands to the left side again. I don't know if I'm being articulate at all. This would be a great one to have from a second camera angle. This is a really, really good view. There we see basically the same pass as the first one. Duke Edward comes in and chops into the space between them to try to get control of Corvus's blade. Corvus isn't going to allow that, so he pulls the blade away. So Edward now in a different sword guard. These are all fairly traditional longsword guards. Edward's swapping between them. He's masking his movement, chop into the blade, but you can see it doesn't really control Corvus's weapon. That second shot is, at that point, Duke Edward's already calling it off. The last thing I'll call out about this is if you look, you see Corvus throw into a different angle here than we have before. So here, blade's up, and then watch as the bottom hand comes towards the camera as opposed to away from the camera. And that lets him get the angle. Here they end up pretty much in the same plane compared to the camera, but it starts with that left hand starts with that left hand crossing the body. And that's how he lands that leg cut. I think we got one or two more passes here. So here you see Corvus is definitely taking, to me this is sort of what would be like Duke Avalok's approach. Carefully measuring range, not letting your weapon get bound, and cutting for the legs, cutting for the arms, just cutting off pieces as the opponent comes in. Not a lot of stabbing, just the occasional stab. Whereas it looks to me like Duke Edward's approach is he wants to cross up the opponent's blade and get in much closer, and then when in close, go for big cuts, sort of belly to belly, or maybe not belly to belly, but much closer. And Corvus isn't allowing that shorter range. So you see 3 feints on the way in for each of them, and it looks like in this case we can take a quick look. And I really like this. It's one of those things. It's a little difficult to tell at speed, so we'll go through slow motion and then we'll go through frame by frame. But what I want you to pay attention to is take a look at Edward do feint, 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 throw, or feint, feint, throw, and Corvus respond, kind of postura, counter postura to each of those different threats until they both fire. I might have gone back a little far. There, feint, 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 cut. Now the challenge with those feints is Corvus didn't respond by doing anything other than backing up, really. So if we go through, Corvus makes, okay, I shouldn't say he doesn't respond much. Here you can see him rotate his left hand towards the camera, here, and this, one of the things I like about this defense is he's actually getting his elbow back so that the bottom of his hilt might actually protect his arm on the outside if he continued that motion. So if at this point the blade comes in towards the camera and then back towards Corvus, he would be able to roll behind his hilt and protect his arm a little bit. But that's just a feint. Now he's feinting an onside shot to the head, so Corvus moves the hand up to protect the onside head, but it's still putting him in a good striking position, and he's fully chambered. So Corvus is able to throw the blow between the next feint that Edward is about to throw out. Now, again, this is a place where we don't see Edward commit to the counter cut quite as quickly, but he does then throw the blow down. Now this one, it might be that Edward got hit in the arm and was in motion as he then counters. That might be a good killing blow. Kind of hard to see if it lands on the arm or the shoulder. If it was the shoulder or torso, it would be a kill. So this one, if they were keeping score, Edward might have won that one, even though he threw that shot just a hair after Corvus started his, because his arm hadn't been disabled yet. I think we got one more pass here to take a look at. This one has a little bit of a camera cut to it, so we start in the middle of it here. It's still kind of neat though. So here we see this is the source video, just starts with this big counter cut right here. So here we see a cool cut from Edward. We see the aftermath of him cutting with the left hand high and right hand low. So we don't quite know how he got into this position. It might have been a big stroke up like this, we're not sure. But here they both cut into each other's weapons. So neither of them take a good blow from that. Here's something I really like. Now, now that, if you look at this space, now that Edward has Corvus's weapon in contact, he rotates around this pivot point, basically playing sticky hand, and Corvus doesn't pull the sword back down and through or straight back up, anything like that, allowing Edward to get some leverage and just rotate around it. Now at this point, Corvus pulls the blade up. If it was just a little slow to recover, however, as you can see, if his blade was still here, what Duke Edward would be doing is winding around it. So his left hand would be towards the camera compared to the sword. So he'd be able to, if he continued that wind and circular motion and Corvus had left his blade out, it would actually push his blade away from the camera, opening him wide up to a chop there. Now, Corvus wisely has recovered his sword. Edward continues that motion, and in this case, it looks like, a little hard to tell whether, it looks like that's the hilt got most of the block because Corvus has been able to push his hands towards the camera, that bottom hand. So what he's done is actually reach across his body, punch his left hand out, and get behind the haft of his sword for his own protection. The other thing to look at is now Edward in this position has his left hand all the way over on his right side of the body, so he's crossed up as well. Where Duke Edward is at is harder to recover from than where Corvus is at this point. There's not a lot of great ways to get your sword out of the position that Duke Edward's in that doesn't involve stepping away, and you can see his momentum is still forward. So like you can kind of rotate the hilt out underneath your own elbow. This is a place where it's actually a little bit better that, in my opinion, that Duke Edward has a short-handled sword. It can help you extricate your weapon from your own body and limbs a little bit better. What a lot of guys will do in a situation like this is even drop their left hand off their weapon. Dangerous, because you lose, not dangerous as in safety, but you have less power and control over your weapon if you do that. So Edward brings his hands up, and here we see Corvus is watching. It looks like he might be ready to throw the head threat. Edward rolls his hands up for the head threat, and we actually see the shot is going to now go for the leg, and Edward can't race the blade down in time to protect against the shot. So that's a spot where you need to protect that whole side of your body with your handle, which is a little difficult because you're vulnerable from the knees up. All right, last pass, I think. This is a nice sneaky shot. So this one, you know, I said you don't want to let go of your sword in that position into one hand. This is an example of a time when you do. So here you see them both taking fairly traditional longsword guards, and they have each other's measure. They know each other's range. In this position, there's some pretty obvious openings, right? But they know that they don't have a good attack on that position for each other. If Duke Edward swings at Corvus's head, it's easy for him to lean back or out, take a half step. Even if he does it with a sliding step, they're still at such range that that's going to be difficult to land. Meanwhile, because of the length of Corvus's arms, if he's holding on to a sword and swings for Edward's legs or torso, his range is going to be limited. But look what he does instead. And the other thing to note that Corvus has swapped his feet. His right foot is now back, which shortens his range, right? So most of the fighting we've seen, he's had his right leg forward, which gives him range because his right hand is forward, and that's the limitation on his reach at this point. Now he just throws, he gets some power, takes a bit of a sliding step, so that sliding step gives him some range, right? So if you look at where his foot was and where it goes, let's look at the things he does to get range. A little bit of a sliding step. So that gives him a little extra reach. He gets about half that distance because the center of his body only moves half that far, right? Then he winds up, this is still going to whiff. It's going to be really easy. Edward's thinking, oh, here it is, dinner. When he reaches for my legs, I'm just going to chop him in the head if he gets close enough, right? But look at all this extra distance he got by letting go with his backhand. So this is a position where, because he built up some momentum, he got the sword firing out, it's heavy, he's still got control and power with his left arm, and if you look, he's rotated through the body a bit as well, so he's generated plenty of power with that big sword for this blow to land hard enough to count, but by sneakily letting go with his right hand, he got that range, and the threat didn't become clear to Duke Edward quickly enough for him to get the defense down and guard it, or to step in and crush him in the head, right? So, to me, one of the things that I like about greatsword fights is they're a lot like good samurai movies, right? When you see two guys with long swords, they both have to attack and commit, generally attack and commit at the same time while finding defense with the same maneuver. So I find myself in the position quite often where if only I had committed to an attack, I could have got the double kill. Well, here's the other thing. Again, SCA, double kill's okay. HMB, ACL, you both get a point, whatever. With real swords in a real fight, if those weapons are in fact dangerous to you and your armor, you know, dying of a leg gash 3 days later from infection, not such a great thing. So here I think we saw a pretty good matchup of different styles. It was a fun set of passes. This is definitely an event I'd like to get out to next year because I hear there's a ton of good fighting. And if you enjoyed the review, let me know if you got any questions or comments. Greatsword, longsword, they're not my primary forms. But if you have any other insights that you collected while watching the video, or there's anything you think I missed, please let me know. Also, we're doing these pretty consistently now, so feel free to, if you like, you can subscribe either to my channel or, sorry, a little noisy. You can subscribe to my channel, or you can just subscribe to the Medieval Vids playlist, and you'll see lots more of these videos. Also, I'm always looking for other content to review. This one was a submission that someone sent in and said, hey, can you go over these fights? I'd love to hear your feedback. So if you have any fights of high caliber and high video quality you would like me to go over, just let me know, and I'll do my best to get to them. All right, thank you very much.